The jungle of Kethvoran was alive with sounds that no human ear had ever been designed to hear. And Sergeant Marin Cole moved through it like she belonged there, even though she absolutely did not. She had been on the planet for 6 days now, cataloging wildlife and mapping terrain for the Terran Frontier Corps. And in that time she had already survived 2 encounters with predators the size of small trucks, a flash flood that turned a dry riverbed into a death trap, and a fungal bloom that made her skin itch for 3 straight hours. But none of that compared to what was about to happen. Brix sat on her left shoulder, his small clawed feet hooked into the reinforced padding of her field jacket, and his black eyes scanned the tree line with the calm focus of a creature that had never once in his life felt afraid of anything. He was a honey badger, genetically uplifted by Terran bioengineers to have sharper cognition, denser bones, thicker skin, and a honey badger metabolism that could process toxins that would kill most mammals in minutes. He weighed 12 kilograms, and he was the meanest living thing Marin had ever known, and she loved him more than she loved most humans. "Easy, Brix," she murmured, as the honey badger's ears flattened and a low growl rumbled from his chest. She heard it a second later, the snap of something heavy moving through the canopy above them, and then another sound to the left, and then another behind. They were surrounded. The first Zale hunter dropped from the trees like a nightmare made of chitin and blade, 8 feet tall, with 4 arms that ended in curved sword-like extensions of bone and metal, its head a wedge-shaped horror of compound eyes and dripping mandibles. 2 more landed on either side, and then 3 more emerged from the undergrowth ahead, their bodies shifting color to match the jungle around them, before locking into a dull gunmetal gray that meant they were done. Hiding. The last one to appear was the largest. Torv Khan, Huntmaster of the Jail Dominion's 7th Circle, stepped into the clearing with the slow confidence of a creature that had never been challenged by anything it could not kill. He stood nearly 9 feet tall, and his blade arms were longer than Marin's entire body, serrated along the inner edge and tipped with a venom that could stop a heart in 30 seconds. His compound eyes locked onto Marin, and his mandibles clicked in what she recognized from her xenocultural briefings as amusement. "Human," he said, his voice a deep rattling buzz translated through a device on his throat. "You are far from your herd." Marin did not run. She had been trained not to, and more importantly, she had read the intelligence files on the jail, and she knew exactly what this was. This was a hunt. The jail were a predator species that had built their entire civilization around the concept of the kill, and their highest cultural tradition was the organized hunting of sentient beings on wild planets. And the more dangerous the prey, the greater the glory. Humans were new to the galaxy, and the Zael had been curious about them for years. "Drop your weapons," Torv Khan commanded, "or we will remove them along with your arms." Marin looked at the 6 hunters surrounding her, and she did the math in her head, and the math said she was going to lose this fight no matter what she did. So she unclipped her pulse rifle and set it on the ground. Then her sidearm. Then her combat knife. Then her wrist-mounted tech gauntlet with its scanner and emergency beacon and microtorch. Torv Khan gestured, and one of his hunters, a lean, younger one, with fresh kill marks scarred into his chest plates, scooped up every piece of equipment and scanned them with a cataloging device. Pulse energy weapon, kinetic sidearm, edged blade, multifunction. Digital tool, the young hunter listed, all threats neutralized, Huntmaster. Torv Khan nodded slowly, and then his gaze drifted to Brix, who was still sitting on Marin's shoulder, puffed up to his full size, every hair standing on end, his teeth bared in a silent snarl that showed pink gums and bone-white fangs. "What is that?" Torv Khan asked. "My companion animal," Marin said, keeping her voice flat and calm. The young hunter, Rel, she would later learn his name, extended one bladed arm and poked Brix in the side. Bricks snapped at the blade so fast that Psych-Rel actually flinched, and the other hunters made a sound that Marin was fairly sure was laughter. 12.3 kilograms, Psych-Rel reported after scanning Bricks. Mammalian, non-venomous, no energy signature, no cybernetic implants beyond minor skeletal reinforcement. Threat classification, negligible. It is a pet, Torv Khan said dismissively. Leave it. Nothing but something cold and sharp settled behind her eyes, and it was not fear. It was patience. Torv Khan turned to address his full hunting party, and his translated voice carried the weight of ritual. The human is catalogued and disarmed, and the hunt is sanctioned under the old laws of the Dominion, and she will be given the traditional mercy, a head start of 1,000 heartbeats into the jungle before we pursue. He turned back to Marin. Run well, human, and die with honor, and your skull will sit in a place of pride in my hall. Marin held his gaze for a long moment, and then she turned and walked into the jungle without a word. She did not run. Not yet. Behind her, the Zael began to count. 1,000 heartbeats was roughly 12 minutes by human reckoning, and Marin used every single second of it, moving fast but controlled through the dense undergrowth, her boots finding solid ground by instinct, mapped the terrain ahead. Bricks clung to her shoulder, silent now, his growl replaced by a focused tension she knew well. He was reading her body language, feeling the shift in her heartbeat and breathing, and he understood on some deep animal level that the rules of their world had just changed. After 10 minutes, Marin found what she was looking for, a rocky outcrop beside a stream, sheltered by the massive roots of a tree that looked like it had been growing since before the Zael species learned to walk upright. She ducked under the roots, pressed her back to the stone, and finally let herself breathe. Then she looked at Bricks. He was staring at her with those black eyes, and his body was still puffed up, and his claws were flexing slowly against her jacket. They took everything, Bricks, she whispered. Guess it is just you and me. Bricks growled, low and steady and full of something that was not fear, because honey badgers did not feel fear, not the earthborn ones, and certainly not the uplifted ones. Marin smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who had grown up on a colony world where the weather tried to kill you 6 months out of the year, who had survived frontier service on 3 hostile planets, who had been trained in survival warfare by instructors who believed that the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy was a human being with nothing left to lose. The Zael thought they had taken her weapons. They had no idea what they had left her with. In the jungle behind her, 1,000 heartbeats came to an end, and the hunt began. And somewhere in the dark, Bricks bared his teeth at nothing and everything, and he was ready. Night fell on Keth Voren like a door slamming shut. One moment the jungle was painted in shades of green and gold, and the next it was black, a total consuming darkness, broken only by the soft glow of bioluminescent fungi that clung to the trunks of trees and pulsed in slow rhythms like the heartbeats of sleeping giants. Marin had spent the last several hours preparing. She had found a hardwood branch as thick as her forearm and spent 40 minutes sharpening one end against a flat stone until it came to a point that could punch through leather. And now she had a spear that was crude and ugly and better than nothing. She had found water, a clear stream running over mineral-rich rocks, and she had drunk deeply and filled a pouch she had fashioned from the broad, waxy leaves of a plant that grew near the riverbank. She had found food, too, or rather Bricks had found it for her, digging up a nest of fat grub-like creatures from beneath a rotting log, presenting them to her with the quiet pride of a hunter who knew his work had value. She had eaten them raw, and they had tasted like dirt and copper and survival. Now she sat beneath the root system of her shelter tree, her back against stone, her spear across her knees, and she listened to the jungle come alive around her in ways that the daytime had only hinted at. Things moved out there in the dark, big things with heavy footsteps, and small things with quick ones, and somewhere far away, something screamed in a voice that sounded almost human, but was not. Marin was not afraid of the jungle. She was afraid of what was hunting her through it. The Zale would be moving now, she knew, spreading out in a crescent formation to sweep the area and flush her toward whatever kill zone they had selected, because that was how they hunted, with patience and coordination, and the absolute certainty that the prey had nowhere to go. But Marin had one advantage they had not accounted for. She looked down at Brix. The honey badger was sitting at her feet, his body low to the ground, his nose twitching as he pulled scent from the night air, and his black eyes caught the faint glow of the fungi and reflected it back like two small dark mirrors. "Time to go to work, buddy," she whispered. She pointed into the darkness, in the direction she knew the Zale had made their camp. She had spotted the faint heat shimmer of their equipment from a ridge 2 hours ago, and she made a gesture with her hand that Brix had been trained to recognize since he was a kit. Scout and sabotage. Brix looked at her for one long moment, and then he turned and vanished into the undergrowth, without a sound, his low, flat body sliding through the vegetation like water through cracks in stone. Marin watched him go, and felt the familiar twist in her gut that came every time she sent him out alone, because no matter how tough he was, and no matter how many times he had come back to her, there was always the chance that this would be the time he did not. She pushed the feeling down and gripped her spear and waited. Brix moved through the jungle with the confidence of a creature that feared nothing, because it had never learned how. His uplifted brain processed the scents and sounds around him with a clarity that went beyond simple animal instinct. He could identify individual Zale by their chemical signatures, he could map the terrain by the way sound bounced off surfaces, and he could sense the electromagnetic hum of their technology from 50 meters away. He found the Zale camp in less than an hour. They had set up in a small clearing, their equipment arranged in precise military order: weapons racks, supply containers, a long-range communications beacon, and 6 resting alcoves where the hunters could enter a light dormancy state that passed for sleep among their kind. Alcoves were occupied. One hunter was on watch, a stocky, scarred veteran named Gon Sur, who sat motionless at the edge of the clearing, with his infrared pits scanning the tree line in slow sweeps. Brix watched from beneath a fallen log, patient and still, for nearly an hour. Then Gon Sur's sweep pattern took him to the far side of the clearing, and Brix moved. He went for Psych Rel first. The young hunter was deep in dormancy, his blade arms folded against his chest, his breathing slow and rhythmic, and he did not stir as Brix crept up beside him and began to work. Brix's teeth were remarkable things, dense as iron, sharp as chisels, and powered by jaw muscles that could generate a bite force wildly disproportionate to his size. And the genetic uplift had only made them stronger. He chewed through the first strap of Psych Rel's gear harness in 30 seconds. Then the second. Then the third. The trophy rack, the toxin dispensers, and the communication array all sagged and slid free as their anchor points gave way, and Brix nudged them silently into the undergrowth, where they would be hard to find in the dark. Then he found the hydraulic line. It ran along the inside of Psych Rel's right blade arm, a thin, flexible tube that carried pressurized fluid to the extension mechanism, and it was protected by a sleeve of woven fiber that was tough, but not tough enough. Brix bit through it with one clean snap. Fluid leaked out in a slow, steady drip, and Psych Rel shifted in his sleep, but did not wake. And Brix was already gone, sliding back into the darkness like a shadow with teeth. He returned to Marin just before dawn, smelling of Zale hydraulic fluid and alien metal. and he climbed into her lap, and pressed his face against her stomach, and made a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a growl. Marin scratched behind his ears, and felt the tension in his small body slowly release. "Work," she said quietly. In the distance, carried on the still morning air, she heard a sound that made her smile, the frustrated cursing of Psych-Rel as he discovered his gear harness in pieces, and his blade arm locked in place, spraying fluid with every attempt to extend it. The young hunter's voice was high and panicked, and she could hear the other hunters responding with sharp clicking sounds that she recognized as anger and contempt. Psych-Rel would not report the true cause of the malfunction, Marin knew, because in Xyel culture, a hunter who lost his weapons to anything less than a worthy opponent was marked with permanent shame, and admitting that a small furry creature had chewed through his equipment while he slept would be worse than death. He would hide it, and he would suffer for it, and his effectiveness as a hunter would be cut in half. One down. Meanwhile, Marin had not been idle during the night either. She had set a deadfall trap near a game trail, a heavy flat stone propped up by a trigger stick, and in the gray light of early morning, she found that it had done its job. Beneath the stone lay a predator about the size of a large dog, six-legged and armored with bony plates, and very dead. She butchered it with a sharp rock, ate what she could, and wrapped strips of its hide around her forearms and shins for protection. Then she took what remained of the carcass and arranged it in the middle of the game trail, where the Xyel would find it. She wanted them to see it. She wanted them to know that she was not running, and she was not hiding, and she was not starving. She wanted them to understand that the prey was comfortable. When Torv Khan found the remains an hour later, he stood over them for a long time, and his mandibles clicked slowly in a rhythm that his hunters recognized as deep thought. "She is resourceful," he said at last. "Good. It will make the kill more worthy." But his hunters shifted uneasily, and they looked at the jungle around them with eyes that were beginning to see it differently. The jungle was no longer just a hunting ground. It was starting to feel like a trap. And somewhere in the trees above them, hidden in the canopy, Brix watched with black eyes and bared teeth, and he was already planning his next move. By the second night, Marin and Brix had settled into a rhythm that was as old as warfare itself. One visible, one invisible, both deadly. During the day, Marin moved through the jungle with deliberate noise, snapping branches and leaving boot prints in soft mud, and occasionally shouting into the canopy just to make sure the Xyel knew exactly where she was. She was bait, and she was good at it. She led them on long winding paths through the worst terrain she could find, through thorn thickets that snagged on their blade arms, across streams where the current was strong enough to throw off their footing, and up ridgelines where loose rock made every step treacherous for creatures that weighed 3 times what she did. The Xyel followed because that was what hunters did, and every hour they spent chasing her was an hour they spent getting more tired and more frustrated and more careless. But the real damage happened at night. To work. On the second night, he found the supply cache. The Xyel had established it in a hollow beneath a rock overhang. Water bladders, ration packs sealed in airtight containers, spare power cells for their weapons and communications equipment, and a long-range beacon that could call for extraction if the hunt went wrong. Brix spent 3 hours in that cache, and when he was done, it was ruined. He punctured every water bladder with his claws, leaving them to drain slowly, so the damage would not be noticed until morning. He dragged the ration packs one by one through a patch of fungus that Marin had identified on her second day as highly toxic to most carbon-based life forms. And then he placed them back in their containers exactly as he had found them, because Brix was not just aggressive, he was smart enough to be cruel about it. He chewed through the insulation on 3 spare power cells until the internal components were exposed to the humid air, which would cause them to short-circuit the next time someone tried to use them. And then he gnawed through the main power coupling on the long-range beacon. Not all the way through, just enough that it would fail under load, so that when someone tried to send a signal, the device would power up and then die in the middle of transmission. It was sabotage worthy of a Special Forces operative, carried out by a 12-kilogram animal with black eyes and an attitude problem. On his way back to Marin, something bit him. It was a centipede-like creature nearly a meter long, with mandibles that injected a neurotoxin powerful enough to paralyze a large mammal in minutes, and it sank those mandibles deep into Brix's left hind leg. Brix turned around and killed it. Then he ate part of it. Then he limped back to Marin with the rest of it hanging from his jaws like a trophy, and by the time he reached her, the swelling in his leg was already going down, because his uplifted liver and kidneys were processing the venom with the same casual efficiency that his Earthborn ancestors had used to shrug off cobra bites for millions of years. Marin took one look at the dead centipede and the bite mark on his leg, and shook her head. "You absolute maniac," she said, and there was so much love in her voice that it hurt. The third night was when things got personal. Gon Sur, the Zael tracker, was the most dangerous member of the hunting party after Torf Khan himself, because his infrared vision was the sharpest of any of them, and he could read heat signatures through dense vegetation at distances that made hiding almost impossible. Without Gon Sur, the Zael were hunting half-blind. Brix found him sleeping in a shallow depression beneath a tree, his head resting on his folded arms, his breathing deep and steady. The infrared pits were located just below his compound eyes, two small, recessed organs, covered by thin membranes that were sensitive to the smallest changes in temperature. And they were completely unprotected during dormancy, because no creature on any world the Jael had ever hunted had been small enough and bold enough and stupid enough to attack a sleeping apex predator in the face. Brix was all three of those things, and proud of it. He launched himself from a low branch and landed directly on Gon Sur's head, and before the hunter could even begin to wake, Brix had his claws hooked into the ridges above the eyes, and his teeth buried in the left infrared pit. Gon Sur woke screaming. It was a sound that tore through the jungle, and sent every living thing within 100 meters running for cover. A high shrieking wail of pain and shock and disbelief that something so small could cause so much agony. He thrashed and clawed at his own face, his blade arms swinging wildly, and one of them came close enough to Brix to shave fur from his back. Honey Badger held on with a grip that was beyond stubborn and into the territory of pure biological spite. By the time the other hunters reached Gon Sur, Brix was gone. He had vanished into the dark the moment he felt the other hunters approaching, leaving Gon Sur on his knees with both infrared pits destroyed and ichor running down his face in thick streams. The tracker was screaming about something small and terrible that had come from nowhere, and his companions stood around him and did not know what to say. On the third day, Marin made her own move. She had spent the morning building a false trail, obvious footprints, broken vegetation, a torn piece of her jacket snagged on a branch, that led down into a narrow ravine with steep walls on both sides. Two hunters took the bait, Dresk, a heavy-set brute with reinforced blade arms, and another whose name Marin never learned. They followed the trail into the ravine, moving fast and confident. And they did not look up. Marin was on the ridge above them, crouched behind a boulder she had spent 2 hours slowly working loose from the soil. When both hunters were directly below her, she threw her weight against the boulder. It went over the edge and took half the hillside with it. The unnamed hunter was fast enough to leap clear, but Dresk was not, and the rockslide caught him across the legs and buried him from the waist down under a ton of broken stone. He was alive, but his legs were crushed beyond repair, and his screams echoed up from the ravine like the cries of something that had just realized it was never going to hunt again. The unnamed hunters scrambled back to the main group and reported what had happened, and Torv Khan went very still for a very long time. Then he made a decision that cracked the foundation of his hunting party. He ordered them to abandon Dresk. In Zale culture, a crippled hunter was dead weight, and carrying him would slow the group and compromise the hunt, and the hunt was sacred above all things. Torv Khan left a mercy blade within Dresk's reach and walked away without looking back. The remaining hunters followed, but something had changed in the way they moved. Their formation was loose, their steps were uncertain, and they kept looking over their shoulders at the jungle behind them, as if they expected it to reach out and grab them. That night, Torv Khan found the ruined supply cache. He held a chewed power cell in one massive clawed hand and turned it over slowly, examining the tooth marks with the careful attention of a hunter who was beginning to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. "What manner of creature does this?" he asked, and his voice was quieter than any of his hunters had ever heard it. His lieutenant checked the original scan data and replied, "Her equipment inventory showed only a small mammalian companion animal. Huntmaster, threat classification was negligible." Torv Khan stared into the darkness between the trees, and for the first time in his long and bloody career, he felt something that was not excitement and was not anticipation. It was doubt. "Update the threat rating," he said, but it was already far too late for that. On the 5th day, Torv Khan stopped hunting like a predator and started hunting like something desperate. He had 3 hunters left: himself, Sikrel, whose blade arm still malfunctioned, and whose shame had turned to a simmering rage that made him sloppy, and Venoth, a silent veteran killer, who had survived more hunts than any other member of the Seventh Circle, and who moved through the jungle with the kind of cold precision that comes from decades of ending lives. 3 hunters out of 6. Their supplies were gone, their long-range beacon was dead, their tracker was blind, and one of their own had been left broken in a ravine, with nothing but a mercy blade and the knowledge that his huntmaster had walked away from him. Torv Khan was not afraid. The Zayal did not have a word for fear, the way humans understood it. But he was angry in a way that went deeper than simple rage. He was angry because he was losing, and he did not understand how. Had no weapons, no technology, no armor, and no allies except a 12-kilogram furball that his scanners had dismissed as irrelevant. And yet she had taken his hunting party apart, piece by piece, with nothing but rocks and sticks, and that cursed animal. He was done being patient. He knew roughly where the human was. His remaining scouts had tracked her to a cave system near a river bend in the eastern quadrant of the jungle, and he was going straight for her with everything he had left. No more crescent formations, no more flushing tactics, no more elegant hunting patterns handed down through generations of Zale tradition. He was going to walk up to that cave, and he was going to kill her with his own hands, and he was going to eat her heart and mount her skull, and then he was going to find that animal and crush it under his foot. That was the plan. It was not a good plan. Marin had been preparing for this moment since the first night. Chosen the cave system deliberately, a narrow entrance that opened into a wider chamber, with a ceiling high enough to stand, but low enough that a 9-foot Zale would have to crouch, and walls close enough together that blade arms could not swing freely. It was a killing ground, designed for something small and fast and desperate, and it was absolutely lethal for something large and overconfident. She had spent 2 full days fortifying it. The approach to the cave mouth was lined with covered pits, shallow holes dug into the soft earth and filled with sharpened hardwood stakes, then covered with a lattice of thin branches and leaves that would hold the weight of the local wildlife, but not the weight of a Zale hunter. She had strung tripwires made of braided vine across the cave entrance at 3 different heights, each one connected to a different surprise: a weighted log, a shower of loose rocks, and a net woven from fibrous jungle creepers that would tangle. blade arms long enough for her to strike. She had smeared herself from head to toe in the musk of a local apex predator she had killed the day before. A six-legged thing with glands that produced a scent so powerful it overwhelmed chemical tracking at close range. And she had her spear, better than the first one, hardened in fire, with a tip she had ground to a needle point on river stones. She was ready. Brix was ready too. He sat at the back of the cave, grooming blood from his fur that was not his own, his body covered in small cuts and bruises from 5 days of nightly raids. But his eyes were bright and his teeth were sharp, and he had not slowed down for a single moment. Marin heard them coming long before she saw them. The crash of heavy bodies through undergrowth, the click and scrape of blade arms against tree trunks, and the low, buzzing speech of Torv Khan giving orders to his remaining hunters. Any more? Good. Psych-Rel came first. The young hunter entered the cave mouth at a half-crouch, his one functional blade arm extended in front of him, his compound eyes adjusting to the darkness, and he did not see the tripwire until it was already too late. The vine caught him across the shins, and the trigger released, and a log the size of Marin's torso swung down from the ceiling on a rope of braided creeper, and hit him square in the chest, with a sound like a hammer striking a drum. Psych-Rel staggered backward, his chitinous chestplate cracked, the air driven from whatever served as his lungs. And in that moment of stunned breathlessness, Marin came out of the shadows like something born from the darkness itself. She drove her spear into the gap between his neck plates, with both hands and all of her weight behind it, and the fire-hardened point punched through the softer tissue beneath, and kept going until it hit something vital, like air escaping a punctured tire, and fell sideways and did not get up. One down. Marin pulled her spear free and retreated deeper into the cave, breathing hard, her hands slick with alien ichor, and she had barely reached the back wall when the ceiling above her exploded inward. Venoth had not come through the entrance. The veteran hunter had gone up and over, climbing the rock face above the cave and cutting through the stone ceiling with his blade arms. And he dropped into the chamber behind Marin like a falling guillotine. He was fast, faster than anything that size had any right to be, and his first strike opened a gash across Marin's ribs that went through her makeshift hide armor and into the muscle beneath. She screamed and twisted away, and his second strike caught her across the thigh, and she fell against the cave wall with her spear between them and blood running hot down her side. Venoth pressed forward, and he was silent. Truly dangerous things are silent, and his blade arms moved in short, precise arcs designed for close-quarters killing, and Marin knew with absolute certainty that she was going to die in the next 10 seconds. Then Brix hit Venoth in the back of the head like a 12-kilogram missile made of fury and teeth. The honey badger had launched himself from a rock shelf near the ceiling, and he landed on the nerve cluster at the base of the hunter's skull, the one vulnerable point in Zale anatomy that was normally protected by a reinforced helmet. Venoth's helmet was gone. Brix had chewed through its chin strap 2 nights ago while the hunter slept, and it had fallen off during the march to the cave. And Venoth had not bothered to retrieve it, because what creature on this primitive world could possibly threaten the back of his skull? The answer to that question was currently biting through his nerve sheath with jaws that could crack a tortoise. Shell. Venoth went berserk. He slammed backward into the cave wall, trying to crush Brix between his body and the stone. And the impact was hard enough to crack rock, but Brix did not let go, because letting go was not something honey badgers did. Venoth spun and thrashed, and raked at his own back with his blade arms, cutting himself in his frenzy, and Brix held on and bit deeper, his claws sunk into the gaps between the hunter's plates, his entire body shaking with the violence of the struggle, but his jaws locked tight. Venoth hit the wall again, and on the third impact, Bricks finally felt something give way beneath his teeth. And the hunter's legs buckled, and the great silent killer crashed to the cave floor with a sound like a tree falling. Bricks rode him all the way down. Marin pulled herself up from the wall, bleeding and shaking, and she looked toward the cave entrance and saw Torv Khan standing there, opening like a wall of chitin and hate. And his blade arms were extended to their full length, and his compound eyes burned with a cold fury that transcended species and language and culture. He looked at Psychrel's body. He looked at Venoth's body. He looked at the small, bloody animal standing over his fallen hunter with its teeth bared and its furs standing on end. And then he looked at Marin, and he came for her. The fight was not fair, and it was not close. Torv Khan was unhurt and undiminished, 9 feet of apex predator with blade arms that could cut through steel. And Marin was wounded and exhausted, and armed with a spear that was already cracked from being driven through Psychrel's neck. He knocked the spear from her hands with a single sweep. He caught her by the throat with one clawed foot and pinned her against the cave wall, and she felt her feet leave the ground and her vision darken at the edges. And his blade arm rose above her in a killing arc. Then Bricks charged his face. Torv Khan swatted him out of the air and sent him tumbling across the cave floor, and Bricks hit the far wall hard enough to leave a dent in the stone. Bricks got up and charged again. Torv Khan threw him sideways with a backhand that would have killed any sane creature, and Bricks bounced off the ground and rolled and got up again. And again, and again, each time more battered, each time slower, each time snarling louder, and each time Torv Khan had to take his attention off Marin for just a fraction of a second to deal with the small, indestructible nightmare that refused to stop coming. On the 5th charge, Torv Khan hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely a heartbeat, born not from fear, but from genuine confusion, because in his entire career, spanning decades and dozens of worlds, nothing this small had ever refused to stay down. That heartbeat was enough. Marin's hand found Venoth's severed blade arm on the cave floor, still attached to a section of the dead hunter's forearm, and she gripped it with both hands and drove it upward with everything she had left. It went through the gap in Torv Khan's mandible plates and into the soft tissue of his throat, and kept going until the tip punched out through the back of his neck. The Huntmaster made no sound. His grip on Marin's throat loosened, and she fell to the ground, gasping, and Torv Khan swayed above her for one long, terrible moment, his compound eyes dimming, his blade arms dropping to his sides. Then he fell, and the cave shook with the impact, and the hunt was over. Marin lay on the cave floor, surrounded by the bodies of apex predators, covered in blood both red and alien, and she could not move, and she could not speak, and she was not sure she was going to survive the next hour. Then something warm and small crawled onto her chest. Bricks was limping badly, and one of his eyes was swollen shut, and there was blood matting the fur along his entire left side. But he was alive, and he was there, and he pressed his face against her neck, and made a sound that was not a growl and not a purr, but something in between. Marin wrapped her arms around him and held him against her heart. "Good boy," she whispered, and her voice broke on the words, "Good boy." Bricks huffed once and closed his good eye and did not let go of her. Neither of them moved for a very long time. The Terran Frontier Corps rescue shuttle broke through the atmosphere of Keth Vorin 2 days after the last hunter fell, its engines burning hot enough to turn the cloud layer orange. And the 6-person extraction team that dropped into the jungle was armed heavily enough to fight a small war. They did not need to fight anything. They found Marin Cole sitting at the mouth of the cave, with her back against a rock, and her legs stretched out in front of her. And she was drinking water from a leaf pouch and watching the sunrise with the calm patience of someone who had already decided she was going to live, and was just waiting for the universe to agree with her. Brix was draped across her lap, his small body bandaged with strips of alien hide that Marin had cut and tied, with hands that shook but did not stop. And he was awake, and he was watching the approaching soldiers with one good eye and a low continuous growl that said very clearly that he had not yet decided if these new arrivals were friends or things that needed killing. Corporal Diaz, the team medic, approached with her hands visible and her voice soft, and she knelt beside Marin and began assessing the wounds, the deep gash across the ribs, the slash on the thigh, the bruising around the throat where Torv Khan's claws had left marks that would take weeks to fade. "Sergeant Cole," Diaz said carefully, "we need to get you onto the shuttle and into the medical bay right now." "Brix first," Marin said. Diaz looked at the honey badger, who was still growling. "He will not let me touch him, Sergeant." "He will if I tell him to," Marin said, and she put her hand on Brix's head and spoke to him in a quiet voice, and the growling stopped, and Brix allowed the medic to lift him onto a stretcher with the resigned dignity of a warrior who had decided that accepting help was not the same as admitting weakness. They sedated him before they could do a full examination, because every time a new pair of hands touched him, his lips pulled back and his teeth came out, and the extraction team collectively decided that a sleeping honey badger was significantly easier to work with than a conscious one. Then they went into the cave. Lieutenant Reeves, the team leader, stood in the entrance and did not speak for a very long time. 3 dead Zale hunters lay inside. Psych Rel with a spear wound through the neck, Venoff with his nerve cluster destroyed, and Torv Khan, the huntmaster of the 7th Circle, with a blade arm driven through his throat by human hands. The cave walls were scored with blade marks and splattered with ichor of 2 different colors, and the floor was littered with the debris of a fight that had been savage and close and absolutely final. Reeves had served in the Frontier Corps for 15 years, and he had seen combat on 6 worlds, and he had never seen anything like this. Said to no one in particular, one unarmed human and a honey badger did this. No one had an answer for that. The news traveled fast. It traveled through military channels first, a classified after-action report that was flagged at every level of command, from the frontier outposts all the way back to Terran Central Command on Earth. And by the time it reached the desk of Admiral Chen, it had been read by over 200 officers, all of whom had the same reaction, which was to read it twice and then sit quietly for a while. Then it went diplomatic. The Zael Dominion demanded the return of Torv Khan's body and his personal trophies, claiming that the hunt had been conducted under their traditional legal framework and that the human had been a legitimate target. The Terran Frontier Corps told them no. They did not say it politely. The Terran ambassador to the Galactic Council filed a formal complaint with the Sentient Rights Tribunal, the Zael Dominion, of illegal hunting of a protected sentient species, and the evidence package included Marin's helmet camera footage. She had lost the helmet during the initial capture, but its automatic recording had been recovered from the Zael supply cache, along with the testimony of Dresk. Dresk had survived. The abandoned hunter had been found by the extraction team in the ravine where Torv Khan had left him, dehydrated and delirious but alive, his legs crushed beyond saving, but his mind intact. And when the Terran medics pulled him from the rubble and gave him water and told him they were not going to hurt him, something broke inside the old hunter, and he began to talk. He talked for a long time. He told them about the hunt and the human who would not run, and he told them about the night raids and the destroyed equipment and the blinded tracker and the dead beacon, and he told them about the creature. He called it Brixketh. Translate perfectly into any human language, but the closest approximation was something like the wrath that will not die, or the rage that outlasts the body, or simply the thing that keeps coming back. He described it with the kind of quiet awe that only a veteran predator could feel for something that had beaten him. And when the Terran translators asked him to clarify exactly what Brixketh was, he said it was small and it was covered in fur, and it had black eyes that held no fear, because fear had never found a place to live inside them. His testimony was transmitted to the Zaal homeworld, and from there, it spread through their communication networks like a virus. And within a week, every hunter in the Dominion had heard the story of the Seventh Circle, and the human and the small furry creature that had destroyed them. The galactic response was even more dramatic. The Interspecies Xenobiology Council, the body responsible for cataloging and classifying every known life form in explored space, issued an emergency bulletin 3 weeks after the incident. The bulletin reclassified Earth's Mellivora capensis, commonly known as the honey badger, from its previous designation of negligible fauna, no tactical significance, to a new classification that had never been used before. Class Omega, persistent threat, do not engage. The footnote on the bulletin read, "Threat classification applies to both wild and human-bonded specimens, and human-bonded specimens are considered more dangerous, not less, due to observed tactical coordination with human handlers and apparent willingness to engage targets of any size without regard for personal survival. Recommend extreme caution and immediate withdrawal upon identification." 17 species formally requested additional information about Earth fauna, and when they received it, when they learned about the planet that had produced not just honey badgers, but also wolverines, hippos, cassowaries, bullet ants, box jellyfish, and saltwater crocodiles, several of them quietly upgraded their diplomatic status with the Terran government, from cordial to extremely cordial, "Please do not bring your animals here." Marin spent 6 weeks in a military hospital recovering from her injuries, and Brix spent those 6 weeks in the bed next to hers because every attempt to move him to the veterinary wing resulted in a level of chaos that the hospital staff decided was not worth the paperwork. She was promoted to lieutenant and offered a position on the Joint Human-Alien Diplomatic Security Detail, a high-profile assignment that involved providing security for interspecies negotiations at the Galactic Council. And she accepted on one condition. Brix came with her. 3 months after Keth Voren, Lieutenant Marin Cole walked into the main briefing room at the Galactic Council Diplomatic Complex on the neutral station of Tessera 4, her dress uniform with new rank insignia on her collar, and Brix was sitting on her shoulder. The room was full of alien delegates from a dozen species, diplomats and advisors and military attachés who represented civilizations that had been traveling between stars for thousands of years before humanity learned to make fire. Every single one of them went silent when she walked in. They were not looking at her. They were looking at Brix. The honey badger sat on her shoulder, with his fur clean and his wounds healed, and both eyes open and bright. And he looked out at the room full of alien apex predators and diplomats and power brokers with the absolute calm of a creature that had walked into the dens of monsters and walked back out again. A Zaal ambassador, not the one from the Seventh Circle, a different one, older and wiser, and very much aware of what had happened on Keth Voron, saw Brix and stood up from his seat and walked out of the room, saying a single word. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Marin sat down in her assigned chair, and Brix adjusted his position on her shoulder and yawned. And his yawn showed every single one of his teeth, the teeth that had chewed through Zaal armor and bitten through nerve clusters and torn apart equipment worth more than most starships. The human ambassador sitting next to Marin leaned over and looked at Brix with the cautious curiosity of someone who had read the classified report and was not entirely sure how much of it to believe. "Is that thing really as dangerous as they say?" he asked. Marin reached up and scratched Brix under the chin, and the honey badger closed his eyes and made a sound like a broken chainsaw trying to purr, and his claws flexed once against her shoulder, in a gesture that was either contentment or a promise of violence, or both. "Worse," she said, and across the room, every alien delegate who heard her, decided, independently and simultaneously, that they were going to be very, very polite to the humans for the foreseeable future. Not because of the pulse rifles, or the warships, or the orbital defense platforms. Because of the 12-kilogram mammal on the lieutenant's shoulder, who was afraid of nothing and loyal to everything, and who had proven on the jungle floor of Keth Vorin that the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy was not a gun or a blade or a bomb. It was a honey badger, with someone worth fighting for.